Welcome to Khanversations. I'm Muqtedar Khan, your host. Today, ladies and gentlemen, there is a new power in the Middle East. It appears that the vacuum that is created in the Middle East as a result of the United States' steady withdrawal from the Middle East, the United States' reluctance to engage with the major powers of the region in a manner that also respects the interests of those regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, has reduced United States' footprint, has reduced the United States' hegemony in the Middle East, and the vacuum that is being created by this steady and gradual withdrawal of the United States from the Middle East has opened the door for China to enter the Middle East. And ladies and gentlemen, yesterday China entered the Middle East. Before I unpack for you the strategic significance of what has happened in Saudi Arabia in the last 48 hours, please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, ring the bell icon. You know the drill. Please go ahead and subscribe to Khanversations. So this is what has happened. Xi Jinping, the president of China, came to Saudi Arabia, and the reception he got was stunning compared to the one that Joe Biden got last year. Xi Jinping, the premier of China, arrived in Saudi Arabia in the last 48 hours, and he got a reception worthy of a king from a king. There were jets flying, there are chariots, there are receptions in palace, and so on and so forth. Compared to the reception that Joe Biden got, this was just spectacular. It clearly sent a signal that China was now very important for Saudi Arabia, and China was taking its visit to Saudi Arabia far more seriously. When Joe Biden went to Saudi Arabia, he had a very narrow agenda, and he was trying his best to convey that he was a reluctant guest. He was trying to convey that he was not here just to meet Saudi Arabia or request Saudi Arabia to help with oil prices.
President Biden said the meeting went well, but he also raised the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
He basically said that he was not personally responsible for it. I indicated I thought he was.
When the president landed, he was greeted by a government official, a far cry from the over-the-top reception for former President Trump in 2017, and MBS's personal welcome.
He was trying his best to convey to the Americans that he was not normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. He had called for making Saudi Arabia a pariah state during the elections. And now he was forced to go because of geopolitical realities, and he wanted to convey the message that, yes, I'm going to Saudi Arabia, but I'm not normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. But no such reluctance from Xi Jinping. He sent the signal that Saudi Arabia matters, and the agreements that have come out are stunning. This is a comprehensive strategic partnership that is taking birth between Saudi Arabia and China. This is going to have a huge impact on the Middle East. It is going to have a huge impact in the global geopolitical landscape, in the global balance of power, if it appears that through this strategic partnership, China and Saudi Arabia are not only going to become longtime partners and partners with deep engagement in multi-sectors, but it will also signal that in many ways, Saudi Arabia is exiting the orbit of the United States, where it has lived during its entire lifetime, really, and now is entering the orbit of China. So in that sense, this is a significant game-changing moment in the Middle East in geopolitics. So what are these agreements? China is already a bigger trading partner for Saudi Arabia than the United States. Chinese buy more oil, and Saudis export more oil and also import more stuff from China. But according to the current agreements, and there are nearly 30 agreements that the two countries have signed, there will be cooperation, obviously, in oil price stabilization, which is critical for the Saudis and all oil-producing countries. But there will be cooperation in the energy sector. There will be collaboration in the solar sector. There will be collaboration in the area of technology. There will also be collaboration in terms of tourism. They're going to encourage citizens from each other's countries to visit another country. And interestingly, both countries have committed to investing in each other. So the Belt and Road Initiative is going to invest, Chinese companies are going to invest in Saudi Arabia through the Belt and Road Initiative and the Vision 2030 that the Crown Prince had for Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund will also be investing in China. So they are going to be essentially developing a strong economic interdependence laced with cultural collaboration. There are also two interesting caveats, or rather two other interesting developments. Number one, both have reaffirmed the principle of sovereignty and have agreed that neither will interfere in the domestic affairs of the other, which means that not only Saudi Arabia, but the Gulf countries and the Arab countries, and taking their lead, most probably a lot of other members of OIC are not going to comment on China's Uyghur policy and the way it may deal with other Chinese dissidents at home. So in that sense, there seems to be an agreement that you don't talk about what I do within my borders, and we will not talk about what you do inside your borders, which means that there will be no pressure from China to improve its human rights record. There will be no conditionality in sales of weapons. And Saudi Arabia was abandoned right in the middle of this war with Yemen. When Biden became president, he stopped selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and started imposing other conditions. And there's always this talk of human rights and democracy, which is a good thing. But for a country that is not inclined towards moving towards democracy, what is good to them is that they can continue to buy weapons from a reliable source, which will not put human rights conditions or domestic changes as preconditions for security guarantees. So in that sense, both Saudi Arabia and China benefit from this agreement that neither will interfere in the other's internal matters. Not only that, this is a big summit. So Xi Jinping is meeting with leaders from GCC and other Arab countries. He's already met with leaders from Iraq and Egypt. And so in that sense, it appears that Saudi Arabia has created a reception for China in the Middle East and has opened the door. And China has marched into the Middle East through this door that Saudi Arabia has opened. So what are going to be the geopolitical implications of this? This is clearly going to impact, first and foremost, the United States. It reduces the United States' influence in the Middle East undoubtedly. If Saudi Arabia, one of the most principal countries in the Arab world and even in the Islamic world, if it has other options other than the US, then it will not have to agree to every demand that the US makes. And so it gives Saudi Arabia more opportunity, more independence in making its own foreign policy. Secondly, the dependence that Saudi Arabia had on the US on defense matters could also diminish. And if Saudis buy less weapons from the US, which means then there will be lesser trade. Right now, all of Saudi assets, etc., are all in dollars. Saudi currency is also pegged to the US dollar. But Xi Jinping has already mooted this issue, and there's a lot of talk of making sure that there is more and more of yuan-based trade. And I think increasingly many countries are diversifying their national reserves and are also holding some assets in yuan. It's not that high. Most countries have 70 to 80% of their reserves or more in dollars, but some have in pounds and euros. So yuan is still not the second or the third. It is probably the fourth currency for reserves for countries which have significant national reserves. But nevertheless, there is talk and movements towards more and more yuan-based trade, which also means less and less dependence and entanglements with the US. So in many ways, you could argue that if this comprehensive strategic partnership really takes off as it is envisioned in the agreements, and even if they pull off half of what they're trying to do, one can safely conclude that China will become a major player in the geoeconomics of the Middle East and the Gulf, and the United States will become a lesser player than what used to be in the past. So basically, the United States hegemony will be diminishing, and China's influence will continue to rise as a result of this agreement. How does that affect India? Now, India has to be very careful because it could frighten India into becoming committing itself to Quad, what India should realize is Saudi Arabia is also doing what India is doing. This is not a zero-sum game. If Saudi Arabia is closer to China, it does not necessarily mean that Saudi Arabia will be further away from India. Just as India says it has a multi-alignment foreign policy, Saudi Arabia too can have a multi-alignment foreign policy, which means that it can have very strong economic and trade relations with China. It can continue to have security arrangements with the United States, and it can also continue to invest in India and working with India with regards to labor and infrastructure and India's investments in Saudi Arabia. So potentially, India should keep in mind that this is not a zero-sum game. Saudi Arabia getting closer to China does not necessarily mean that China is going to distance itself from India. There are some analysts in India who are already saying that MBS canceled his trip to India just before the G20 summit, and now suddenly this major agreements with China, which couldn't have happened overnight. So already things were cooking. And so is MBS cancellation of visit to India an indication that there's some kind of a conspiracy against India taking place? No, it is not. Saudi Arabia is trying to become a new Saudi Arabia. It is making lots of changes at the domestic level, and it is also trying to pursue a more autonomous and more independent foreign policy, just like India. So that is an important thing to conclude. So what does it mean to sum up? Sum up is very clear. The war in Ukraine has unleashed changes at the global level, and this is one of the major developments as a result of the decline of the liberal order and the decline of the control that the US and its Western allies had on the global system. Because the system is getting a bit weaker, it is quite clear that more and more countries are enjoying more autonomy to make changes not only in the global structure, but in regional structure and in their own grand strategies. So you're seeing this happen with India, you're seeing this happen with Iran, you're seeing this happen with Russia, and now you see it happening with Saudi Arabia too. So that's number one thing, that we are seeing a transition in the global system. We are moving more and more towards a multipolar world, and what Saudi Arabia is doing is just one of the things that you will see happen more often in a multipolar world. And the number two is that it clearly indicates that the United States will have to be far more engaged, far more respectful of its allies in the Middle East. The US will have to essentially spend more energy and more resources to get back its influence in the region. And it cannot treat a major partner the way they have been treating Saudi Arabia in the last 1 or 2 years. To give you an example how hypocritical US policy has been to Saudi Arabia, because the Saudis were responsible for the killing of a Saudi journalist in Turkey, Adnan Khashoggi, who had very strong ties in Washington, D.C., the United States, and Biden in particular, wanted to make Saudi Arabia a pariah state.
Yes, and I said it at the time. Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. And I would also, as pointed out, I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sale of material to the Saudis, who they're going in and murdering children, and they're murdering innocent people. And so they have to be held accountable.
And then Israel kills an American journalist, Akle, and nothing. Absolutely nothing. The US not only is trying to whitewash a crime committed by Israel, but no attempt to make Israel a pariah state. It's exactly double standards like this which make US allies, especially from the global south, very nervous about to what extent can they rely on the United States. And the US cannot complain because both Biden as well as the many prominent senators have all said that we need to rethink our foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia. We need to rethink our foreign policy towards Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia is doing the rethinking for you. So this is the second thing. And as far as India is concerned, India should not overreact to this development. This is significant. It can have an impact on Saudi Indian relations to some extent, but India needs to wait and watch and see how it actually impacts investments from Saudi Arabia and India, and then act accordingly. I hope you found this analysis interesting, beneficial, and if it did, please subscribe to Khanversations, like the video, and press the bell icon. And until next time, which could be in the next 24 hours, be safe, be happy.